So welcome everyone to our seminar for the Center for Logic and Philosophy of Science. It's my great pleasure to introduce today Robert Brandom as our speaker. Professor Brandom is the current Cardinal Mercier Chair at KU Leuven. You should have already heard some more elaborate introductions for the Mercier lectures yesterday, so I'll keep it brief. Professor Brandom is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at University of Pittsburgh. He's also currently the Spinoza Chair at University of Amsterdam. Professor Brandom has written many books, including Making It Explicit, Reasoning, Representing, and Discursive Commitment, Articulating Reasons, An Introduction to Inferentialism, Between Saying and Doing, Toward an Analytic Pragmatism, based on the 2006 Oxford John Locke lectures, and many more. Our speaker is so very accomplished, I could run well into the seminar time with further remarks. Professor Brandom is one of the leading philosophers in the analytic tradition today, and on behalf of everyone in the center, let me offer our warmest welcome. Now, a note about questions. So the way we'll do the question and answer session today is if you would please write to me as you think of questions you'd like to ask along the way. I will pre-sort these questions and then call on you during the Q&A session to read and then explicate your question. And this way we should get a more well-structured discussion. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Professor Brandom, who is presenting From Logical Expressivism to Expressivist Logic, Sketch of a Program and Some Implementations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Traditionally, two principal issues in the philosophy of logic are the demarcation question, what distinguishes specifically logical concepts and vocabulary, and the correctness question, what's the right logic? One of the binding agents tying together semantic and logical inferentialism is a distinctive philosophy of logic, logical expressivism. This is the view that the expressive role that distinguishes logical vocabulary is to make explicit the inferential relations that articulate the semantic contents of the concepts expressed by the use of ordinary non-logical vocabulary. If one offers this logically expressivist, semantically inferentialist answer to the demarcation question, the correctness question lapses. It's replaced by a concrete task. For each bit of vocabulary to count as logical in the expressivist sense, one must say what feature of reasoning, to begin with, of reasoning with non-logical concepts it expresses. Instead of asking, for instance, what the right conditional is, we ask what dimension of normative assessment of implications various conditionals make explicit. For instance, the poor, benighted, and unloved classical two-valued conditional expressed by the horseshoe makes explicit the sense of good inference in which it's a good thing if an inference does not have true premises and a false conclusion. Well, we can acknowledge at least that implications that don't at least have that property are bad. Intuitionistic conditionals, in the broadest sense, let us assert that there's a procedure for turning an argument or a proof for the premises of an inference into an argument for the conclusion. C.I. Lewis's hook of strict implication codifies the sense in which it's a good feature of an inference if it's impossible for the premises to be true and its conclusion not to be true, and so on. There can in principle be as many conditionals as there are dimensions along which we can endorse implications. In spite of its irenic neutrality concerning the correctness question, one might hope that a new approach to the philosophy of logic, such as logical expressivism, would not only explain features of our old logics, but ideally also lead to new developments in logic itself. I think this is in fact the case, and what I want to do today is offer a sketch of how. I take it that the task of logic is to provide mathematical tools for articulating the structure of reasoning. Although for good and sufficient historical reasons, the original test bench for such tools was the codification of specifically mathematical reasoning, the expressive target ought to be reasoning in general, including, for instance, and to begin with, its more institutionalized species, such as reasoning in the empirical sciences, in law courts, and in medical diagnosis. We can approach a target notion of the structure of reasoning in two stages. The first stage distinguishes what I'll call the relational structure that governs our reasoning practices. Lewis Carroll's fable, Achilles and the Tortoise, vividly teaches us to distinguish, in John Stuart Mill's terms, premises from which to reason, including those codifying implication relations, from rules in accordance with which to reason, demonstrating that we can't forego the latter wholly in favor of the former. Gil Harman sharpens the point in his argument that there are no such things as rules of deductive reasoning. If there were, he argues, presumably a paradigmatic one would be, if you believe P, and if you believe if P then Q, then you should believe Q. But he points out that would be a terrible rule. You might have much better reasons against Q than you have for either of the premises. In that case, you should give up one of them. He concludes that we should distinguish relations of implication from rules for the activity of inferring. The fact that P, if P then Q, and not Q are incompatible, because P and if P then Q stand in the implication relation to Q, normatively constrains our reasoning activity, but does not by itself determine what it's correct or incorrect to do. The normative center of reasoning is the practice of assessing reasons for and against conclusions. Reasons for conclusions are normatively governed by relations of consequence or implication. Reasons against conclusions are normatively governed by relations of incompatibility. These relations of implication and incompatibility, which constrain normative assessment of giving reasons for and against claims, amount to the first significant level of structure of the practice of giving reasons for and against claims. These are, in the first instance, what Sellers calls material relations of implication and incompatibility. That is, they don't depend on the presence of logical vocabulary or concepts, but only on the contents of non- or pre-logical concepts. The inference from the light is red to the light is colored is an example. According to semantic inferentialism, these material relations of implication and incompatibility are what articulate the conceptual contents expressed by the pre-logical vocabulary that plays an essential role in formulating the premises and conclusions of inferences. Once we've distinguished these relations from the practice or activity of reasoning that they normatively govern, we can ask after the algebraic structure of such relations. In the 1930s, Tarski and Gentzen, in the founding documents of the model theoretic and proof theoretic traditions in the semantics of logic, though differing in many ways in their approaches, completely agree about the algebraic structure of logical relations of consequence and incompatibility. Logical consequence satisfies contexted reflexivity or containment, monotonicity, and idempotence, which is Gentzen's cut, sometimes called cumulative transitivity. In Tarski's terms, there are these three principles. The consequences of X contain the premises X. And if one set of premises Y contains another X, then the consequences of Y contain the consequences of X. And the consequences of X are just the consequences of X. Logical incompatibility satisfies explosion, the implication of everything by logically inconsistent sets. Perhaps these are indeed the right principles to require of specifically logical relations of consequence and incompatibility. But logical expressivists must ask a prior question. What's the structure of material relations of consequence and incompatibility? This is a question that the modern logical tradition has not thought about at all. but the answer one gives to it substantially shapes the logical enterprise when it's construed as expressivism does. We can think of the statements of implication and incompatibility as expressing what's included in a premise set and what's excluded by it. In a semantic inferentialist spirit, we can say that the elements of a premise set are its explicit content, what's contained literally in the premise set, and its consequences are its implicit content, now in the literal sense of what's implied by it. It's reasonable to suppose that what's explicitly contained in a premise set, the premises, is also part of its implicit content. That's the first of Tarski's principles. And it's accordingly plausible to require that material consequence relations, no less than logical ones, be reflexive in an extended sense. If the premises explicitly contain a sentence, they also implicitly contain it, regardless of what other auxiliary premises are available. Monotonicity, by contrast, is not a plausible constraint on material consequence relations. It requires that if an implication holds, and the same thing goes for incompatibility, then it holds no matter what additional auxiliary hypotheses are added to the premise set. Adding new premises never subtracts any consequences. But outside of mathematics, almost all of our actual reasoning is defeasible. This is true in everyday reasoning by auto mechanics and on computer helplines, in courts of law, and in medical diagnosis. It's true of subjunctive reasoning generally. If I were to strike this dry, well-made match, it would light. Well, but not if it's in a very strong magnetic field. Unless, of course, additionally, it were in a Faraday cage, then it would light, but not if the room were evacuated of oxygen, and so on. The idea of laws of nature reflects an approach to subjunctive reasoning deformed by a historically conditioned Procrustean ideology whose shortcomings show up in the need for idealizations, criticized by Nancy Cartwright in her book, How the Laws of Physics Lie, and for physics avoidance, diagnosed by Mark Wilson in his book, Wandering Significance. Defeasibility of inference, hence non-monotonicity of implication relations, is a structural feature not just of probative or permissive reasoning, but also of dispositive committive reasoning. And ceteris paribus clauses do not magically turn non-monotonic implications into monotonic ones. The proper term for a Latin phrase whose recitation can do that is magic spell. The expressive function characteristic of ceteris paribus clauses is rather explicitly to mark and acknowledge the defeasibility, hence non-monotonicity, of an implication that's codified in a conditional, to mark it, not to cure it somehow by fiat. The logical expressivist thinks of logical vocabulary as introduced to let one say, in the logically extended object language, what material relations of implication and incompatibility articulate the conceptual contents of logically atomic expressions. And, as a bonus then, to express the relations of implication and incompatibility that articulate the contents of the newly introduced logical expressions as well. There's no good reason to restrict the expressive ambitions with which we introduce logical vocabulary to making explicit the rare material relations of implication and incompatibility that are monotonic. Comfort with such an impoverished ambition is a historical artifact of the contingent origins of modern logic in logicist and formalist programs aimed at codifying specifically mathematical reasoning. It's to be explained by appeal to historical causes, not good philosophical reasons. Of course, since our tools were originally designed with that task in mind, as we've inherited them, they're best suited for the expression of monotonic rational relations. But we shouldn't emulate the drunk who looks for his lost keys under the lamppost rather than where he actually dropped them, just because the light is better there. We should look to shine light where we need it most. Notice that reasons against a claim are as defeasible in principle as reasons for a claim. Material incompatibility relations are no more monotonic in general than material implication relations. Claims that are incompatible in the presence of one set of auxiliary hypotheses can in some cases be reconciled by suitable additions of collateral premises. Cases with this shape are not hard to find in the history of science. But what about cut, the principle of cumulative transitivity? It's expressed in Tarski's algebraic meta-language for consequence relations by the requirement that the consequences of a premise set are just the consequences of the original premise set. And by Gentzen as the principle that adding to the explicit premises of a premise set something that's already part of its implicit content doesn't add to what's implied by the premise set. Thought of this way, cut is the dual of what's usually thought of as the weakest acceptable structural principle that must be required if full monotonicity is not. What's called cautious monotonicity is the structural requirement that adding to the explicit content of a premise set sentences that are already part of its implicit content, already implied by it, should not defeat any implications of that premise set. Even though there might be, in a non-monotonic setting, some additional premises that would infirm the implication, cautious monotonicity says sentences that are already implied by the premise set are not among these defeating additional conditions. We can think generally about the structural consequences of the process of explicitation of content, in the sense of making what's implicitly contained in a premise set, in the sense of being implied by it, explicit as part of the explicit premises. This is moving something from the right side of the implication turnstile to the left side, from the consequences to the premise side. Cautious monotonicity says that explicitation in this sense, treating as an explicit premise what's implied by your explicit premises, never subtracts implicit content. Cut says that explicitation never adds implicit content. And cautious monotonicity says that explicitation never subtracts implicit content. Together, they require that explicitation is inconsequential. Moving a sentence from the right side of the implication turnstile, the conclusion side, to the left-hand side of premises doesn't change the consequences of the premise set at all, doesn't add or subtract anything. It has no effect whatever on the implicit content, on what's implied. And there's a corresponding notion of explicitation involving making explicit what's implicitly excluded by a premise set. Notice that explicitation in this sense is not at all a psychological matter. And in fact, it's not yet even strictly a logical notion. For even before logical vocabulary has been introduced, we can make sense of explicitation in terms of the structure of material consequence relations. Noting the effects on implicit content of adding as an explicit premise sentences that were already implied is already a process available for investigation at the semantic level of the pre-logic, before we've introduced any logical vocabulary or concepts. Now, it might well be sensible to require the inconsequentiality of explicitation as a structural constraint on logical consequence relations. Both Tarski and Gentzen do. But just as for the logical expressivist, there's no good reason to restrict the rational relations of implication and incompatibility that we seek to express with logical vocabulary to monotonic ones. There's no good reason to restrict our expressive ambitions to consequence relations for which explicitation is inconsequential. On the contrary, there's every reason to want to use the expressive tools of logical vocabulary to investigate cases where explicitation does make a difference to what's implied. One such case of general interest is where the explicit contents of a premise set are the records in a database. Think of the premises as just the records that are entered in some database, whose implicit contents consist of whatever consequences can be extracted from those records by applying an inference engine to them. It's by no means obvious that one is obliged to treat the results of applying the inference engine as having exactly the same epistemic status as actual entries in the database. A related special case is where the elements in the premise set consist of experimental data, perhaps measurements or observations, whose implicit content consists of the consequences that can be extracted from them by applying a theory to them. In such a case, explicitation is far from inconsequential. On the contrary, when the CERN supercollider produces observational measurements that confirm what hitherto had been purely theoretical predictions extracted from previous data, the transformation of rational status from mere prediction, implicit in prior data, to actual empirical observation is an event of the first significance, no less important than the observation of something incompatible with the predictions extracted by theory from prior data. This is the very nature of empirical confirmation of theories. And it often happens that confirming some conclusions extracted by theory from the data infirms other conclusions that one otherwise would have drawn. Imposing cut and cautious monotonicity as global structural constraints on material consequence relations amounts to equating the epistemic status of premises and conclusions of good implications. But in many cases, we want to acknowledge a distinction, assigning a lesser status to the products of perhaps risky, defeasible inference. In an ideal case, perhaps this distinction shrinks to nothing. Maybe that's partly constitutive of being a logically ideal case. But we also want to be able to reason in situations where it's important to keep track of the difference in status between what we take ourselves to know and the shakier products of our theoretical reasoning from those premises. At least we shouldn't build into our global structural conditions on admissible material relations of implication and incompatibility assumptions that preclude us from introducing logical vocabulary to let us talk about those rational relations, so important, for instance, for confirmation in empirical science. The methodological advice not unduly to limit the structure of rational relations to which the expressive ambitions of our logic extends applies particularly forcefully to the case of incompatibility relations. The structural constraint the classical tradition, for which Gentzen and Tarski speak, imposes on incompatibility relations is explosion, the requirement that from incompatible premises, anything and everything follows. This structural constraint corresponds to nothing whatsoever in ordinary reasoning practices, not even as institutionally codified in legal or scientific argumentative practices. It's a pure artifact of classical logical machinery, the opportune but misleading translation of the two-valued conditional into a constraint on implication and incompatibility that reflects no corresponding feature of the practices that apparatus, at least according to the logical expressivist, has the job of helping us to talk about. It's for that reason a perennial embarrassment to teachers of introductory logic, who are forced on this topic to adopt the low invocations of authority, pressure tactics, and rhetorical devices otherwise associated with commercial hucksters, con men, televangelists, and all the other sophists from whom, since Plato, we've hoped to distinguish those who are sensitive to the normative force of the better reason, whose best practices we have since Aristotle hope to codify with the help of logical vocabulary and its rules. In the real world, we're often obliged to reason from sets of premises that are explicitly or implicitly incompatible. An extreme case in Anglo-American civil law is the legal practice called pleading in the alternative. In this case, the defense attorney argues, my defense is first, that I never borrowed your lawnmower. Second, that it was broken when you lent it to me. And third, that it was in perfect condition when I returned it. In civil law, you have to show that none of those things is true. In pleading this way, though, I'm not confessing to having assassinated Kennedy, not absolutely everything follows from this incompatible set of claims. And examples even from high scientific theory are not far to seek. We shouldn't impose structural conditions on our pre-logic that preclude us from logically expressing material relations of incompatibility that characterize our actual reasoning. Explosion is not a plausible structural constraint on material relations of incompatibility, and our logic should not require us to assume that it is. So I've said the basic claim of logical expressivism in the philosophy of logic is that the expressive role characteristic of logical vocabulary is to make explicit in the object language relations of implication and incompatibility, including the material pre-logical ones, that according to semantic inferentialism articulate the conceptual contents expressed by non-logical vocabulary, paradigmatically, ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. The paradigms of logical vocabulary are the conditional, which codifies relations of implication that normatively structure giving reasons for claims, and negation, which codifies relations of incompatibility that normatively structure giving reasons against claims. To say that a premise set implies a conclusion, we can write in the meta language gamma turnstile A. And that turnstile is called the snake because of its wiggly horizontal. And the wiggly horizontal, the fact that it's the snake turnstile, marks that we're not assuming monotonicity. To say that a premise set is incompatible with the conclusion, we can write in the meta language gamma together with A implies perp. That is a special symbol introduced just to say that what's on the left of the turnstile is incoherent. In order to perform its defining task of codifying implication relations in the object language, conditionals need to satisfy the Ramsey condition. Gamma implies A arrow B, if A then B, just in case gamma together with A implies B. A premise set implies a conditional just in case the result of adding the antecedent to the premise set implies the consequent. A conditional that satisfies this equivalence can be called a Ramsey test conditional, since Frank Ramsey was first proposed thinking of conditionals this way. To perform its expressive task of codifying incompatibility relations in the object language, negation needs to satisfy the minimal negation condition, that gamma implies not A, just in case gamma together with A are incoherent. Gamma and A are incompatible. A premise set implies not A in case A is incompatible with the premise set. It follows in this case that not A is the minimum incompatible of A in the sense of being implied by everything that's incompatible with A. The contradictory is what's implied by all the contraries. And if you look at the Ramsey condition, you'll see that the conditional A arrow B is the minimal, is introduced as the minimal sentence that's implied by everything such that if you combine it with A, you get B as a consequence. We should aspire to expressive logics built onto material incompatibility relations that are non-monotonic, as well as material implication relations that are non-monotonic. And that means that just as an implication relation, gamma turnstile A, can be defeated by adding premises to gamma, so can an incompatibility. Sometimes gamma's incompatibility with A can also be defeated, the incompatibility cured by adding some additional auxiliary hypotheses to gamma. And while, given the role negation plays in codifying incompatibilities, an incompatible set, gamma together with A, will imply the negations of all the premises that are its explicit members, it need not therefore imply everything. In substructural expressive logics built on Gentzen's multi-substance system, the condition that emerges naturally is not ex falso quodlibet, the classical principle of explosion from the false anything, but what Leuven calls ex fixo falso quodlibet. This is the principle that if gamma is not only materially incoherent, in the sense of explicitly containing incompatible premises, but persistently so, that is, incurably, indefeasibly incoherent, in that all of its supersets are also incoherent, then we can say, well, we have to throw up our hands and mark that by implication of everything. We just don't know what to do with an incurably incompatible set of premises. And in a monotonic setting, this is equivalent to the usual explosion principle. But in non-monotonic settings, the two conditions come apart. One conclusion that might be drawn from expressive logics is that what mattered all along was always ex fixo falso quodlibet. Classical logic just didn't have the expressive resources to distinguish this from explosion of all incoherent sets, including those that are curably incoherent. So the basic idea of expressivist logic is to start with a language consisting of non-logical, that is, logically atomic sentences, sentences in which no logical vocabulary occurs, already structured by relations of material implication and incompatibility. In the most general case, we think of those relations as satisfying the structural principle only of extended reflexivity, that what's explicitly contained in a premise set is also implied by it. We don't assume monotonicity, we don't assume cautious monotonicity, and not even transitivity in the form of cut for our material-based relation. We then want to introduce logical vocabulary on top of such a language to extend the language. This means extending the language to include arbitrarily logically complex sentences formed from the logically atomic sentences by repeatedly applying conditionals and negations, and then extending the underlying material consequence and incompatibility relations to that logically extended language in such a way that the Ramsey condition and the minimal negation condition both hold. And in fact, along the way, we'll throw in what I call the Boolean helper monkeys of conjunction and disjunction as well. But the paradigmatic sentential logical vocabulary is the conditional codifying implication and negation codifying incompatibility. A basic constraint on such a construction is set out by a simple argument due to Ulf Lobel, one of my collaborators in our logic group. He realized that in the context of contexted reflexivity, the principle that if A is an explicit premise of an implication, then it's a consequence as well, and of a Ramsey conditional, cut, transitivity, entails monotonicity. If we start with some arbitrary implication, gamma implies A, we can derive gamma together with arbitrary B implies A. That is, we can show that arbitrary additions to the premise set, arbitrary weakenings of the implication, preserve all the consequences. And that's just monotonicity. For we can argue in the way I've displayed, assume that gamma implies A, well then gamma together with A and anything else still implies A, since A is one of the premises, it's also a consequence. Now, gamma together with A implies the conditional, if B then A, because adding B to gamma together with A implies A. Now, we can cut on A, because by the assumption, gamma already implies A, and then applying the Ramsey condition in the other direction, we get that gamma together with B implies A. Since in our expressivist logics, we want to explore adding Ramsey conditionals to codify material implication relations that are reflexive, but that don't satisfy cut, so that pre-logical explicitation is not treated as always inconsequential, we have to give up cut in the logical extension as well. It's a minimal condition of logical vocabulary playing its defining expressive role that introducing it extend the underlying material consequence and incompatibility relations conservatively. My former colleague Noah Belknap motivates this constraint independently based on conditions raised by Pryor's toxic tonk connective. The logical expressivist, though, has independent reasons to insist on conservativeness, because only vocabulary that conservatively extends the underlying material relations of consequence and incompatibility on which it's based could count as expressing those conditions explicitly, which is what we're aiming to have logical vocabulary do. So there shouldn't be any implications or incompatibilities involving only the old non-logical vocabulary that hold or fail to hold in the structure logically extended to include new logical vocabulary that don't hold or fail to hold already in the material base structure. Since that material base structure is in general non-monotonic and non-transitive, satisfying only contexted reflexivity, so must be the global relations of consequence and incompatibility that result from extending them by adding logical vocabulary. And we now know how to do that in the context of Gentzen-style substructural proof theory. Now I'll be summarizing technical work by Ulf Lobel, took his PhD at Pitt, now at Concordia University, and current Pitt PhD student Dan Kaplan. We produce substructural logics codifying consequence and incompatibility relations that are not globally monotonic or transitive by modifying Gentzen systems in 3 sequential stages. Now, I want to say, I'm going to go through some of the details here. If you don't follow all of it, that's okay. The important thing philosophically is the idea of what we're doing. But I want to say enough about how we do it to make it intelligible. So we modify Gentzen systems in 3 sequential stages. Gentzen's derivations all begin with what he called initial sequence, in effect axioms, which are the leaves of all the logical proof trees. And for Gentzen, they're instances of immediate or simple reflexivity. That is, he always starts with things of the form A implies A. We impose instead the structural rule that adds all sequence that are instances of contexted reflexivity. All sequence of the form gamma together with A implies A together with any set theta. Making this change does not really change Gentzen's system LK of classical logic at all, for he can derive the contexted version of reflexivity from immediate reflexivity by applying monotonicity, which is weakening, what he called thinning. So, as others have remarked, Gentzen does not need the stronger principle of unrestricted monotonicity in order to get the full system LK of classical logic. He could make do with the very restricted monotonicity principle that we accept of contexted reflexivity, which allows arbitrary weakening only of sequence that are instances of reflexivity, that is, which have some sentence that already appears on both sides of the sequent one as weakening. Since all Gentzen's initial sequence are instances of immediate reflexivity, being able to weaken them turns out to be equivalent to being able to weaken all logically derivable sequence. The weakenings can be permuted up the proof trees past applications of connective rules in very much the same way Gentzen appeals to in proving his cut elimination Hauptsatz. Substituting the stronger version of reflexivity for Gentzen's version accordingly allows dropping the structural condition of monotonicity. Contexted reflexivity arises most naturally in Tarski's algebraic topological way of thinking about consequence relations as the principle that every premise set is contained in its consequence set, if you think back to the first display. So doing that, we don't have to, by starting with contexted reflexivity, we don't need to assume monotonicity. And we also don't impose cut or transitivity as a global structural constraint. But it turns out that Gentzen's cut elimination theorem will still be provable for all proof trees whose leaves are instances of contexted reflexivity. So the purely logical part of the system will satisfy cut. The next step, the second step in modifying Gentzen's system, is to add axioms in the form of initial sequence relating logically atomic sentences that codify the initial base of material implications and incompatibilities. Whenever some premise set of atomic sentences gamma 0 implies an atomic sentence A, we add gamma 0 implies A to the initial sequence that are eligible to serve as leaves of proof trees, initiating derivations. We require that this set of sequence 2 satisfies contexted reflexivity, and we'll be able to show that our connective rules preserve this property. This is exactly the way Gentzen envisaged substantive axioms being added to his logical systems so that those systems could be used to codify substantive theories, for instance, when he considers the consistency of arithmetic. The crucial difference is that he required those sequence, like the governing logically complex formulae, satisfying the structural conditions of monotonicity and cod, and we don't require that. We'll introduce logical vocabulary to extend material consequence and incompatibility relations that don't satisfy monotonicity and are not idempotent, not transitive. The third stage in modifying Gentzen's systems is accordingly to extend the pre-logical language to include arbitrarily logically complex sentences formed from that pre-logical vocabulary by the introduction of logical connectives. Gentzen's connective rules show how antecedent consequence and incompatibility relations governing the logically atomic base language can be systematically extended so as to govern the sentences of the logically extended language. And in fact, Gentzen's own rules can be used to do this with only minor tweaks. Like his student Katonen's version of Gentzen's rules, ours are reversible. They're unlike the Gentzen-Katonen rules in that we mix additive and multiplicative rules. They're all equivalent to Gentzen's own rules in the presence of a global structural rule of monotonicity. So we just use variants of his rules, which given his structural assumptions are all equivalent. But since we relax those structural conditions, we relax monotonicity, these come apart, and we've picked different versions of them than he did. So for instance, Gentzen's left rule for conjunction allows us to move from gamma together with A implies C to gamma together with A and B implies C. And that builds in monotonicity on the left of the turnstile. We can't have that since in the material base, it can happen that adding B as a further premise defeats the implication of C by gamma and A. We allow instead only the move from gamma, comma, A, comma, B to C to gamma, comma, A and B to C. And a similar shift is needed in the right rule for disjunction. I said before that from a logical expressivist point of view, for the conditional to do its defining job of codifying implication relations in the object language, it needs to satisfy the Ramsey condition. In Gentzen's setting, this amounts to endorsing two principles, what he calls conditional proof on the left and contrary conditional proof on the right. The first is just Gentzen's right rule for the conditional. If gamma together with A implies B, then gamma implies A arrow B, if A then B. The other says you can go in the other direction. If gamma implies the conditional, then gamma together with A implies B. Now that second rule isn't a Gentzen rule, and it can't be. It's crucial to his meta theory that all of his rules simplify. It never happens that there's more logical connectives above the line than there are below. The only simplifying rule Gentzen has is cut, and it's of the essence of his program to show that he can do without that rule, that every derivation that appeals to that single simplifying rule can be replaced by a derivation that does not appeal to it. Katonen-style invertibility of connective rules, which makes root-first proof searches possible, though, requires not only conditional proof, but the simplifying rule, converse conditional proof. And it's possible to show that this rule, too, like cut, is admissible in Gentzen's sense, in that every derivation that uses it can be replaced by a derivation that does not. It can be shown that our versions of Gentzen's connective rules produce a conservative extension of any non-monotonic material-based consequence relation, including non-monotonic incompatibility relations. That is, in the absence of explicitly imposing a structural rule of monotonicity, or cut, the connective rules do not force global monotonicity. So the resulting logically extended consequence relation is non-monotonic. And the non-monotonicity extends to logically complex formulae. For instance, as I said a minute ago, from the fact that gamma together with A implies C, it doesn't follow that gamma together with A conjoined with B implies C. So that from gamma implies A and C, it doesn't follow that gamma implies the conjunction of A and B, conditional C. The logical language that results permits the explicit codification using ordinary logical vocabulary of arbitrary non-monotonic, non-transitive material consequence relations in which pre-logical explicitation is not inconsequential. And yet, the system is supraclassical. That is, all the theorems of Gentzen's system LK of classical logic can be derived in this system. For if we restrict ourselves to derivations, all of whose leaves are instances of contexted reflexivity, that is, are of the form gamma together with A, turnstile A comma theta, the result is just the theorems of classical logic. It's only if we help ourselves to initial sequence that are not of that form, the axioms that codify material relations of consequence and incompatibility, that we derive non-classical results. Gentzen never needed to require monotonicity as a global structural rule. He could just have used initial sequences that correspond to contexted reflexivity. That gives him all the weakening behavior he needs. Further, if we look only at sequence that are derivable no matter what material base relation we extend, we find that the logic of our system in this sense too is just classical logic. Perhaps not surprisingly, if following Gentzen we use essentially the same connective rules but restrict ourselves to single succedent sequence, the result is a globally non-monotonic, non-transitive, super-intuitionist logic instead of being supraclassical. Now, I've been talking about the logical extension of non-monotonic material consequence relations rather than the extension of non-monotonic material incompatibility relations, but the latter are equally well behaved. The multi-succedent connective rules for negation are just Gentzen's. But it's not the case that any materially incoherent premise set implies every sentence. Such premise sets imply both the sentences they explicitly contain and the negations of all those sentences, but they don't imply everything else. But that's because, if a premise set explicitly contains both A and not A for some sentence, then it implies everything. But that's because it then persistently or monotonically is incoherent, and those sets explode. That is, those sets, the ones that contain A and not A, are not only incoherent themselves, but every superset of them is incoherent. So, in a clear sense, the logic that we have is monotonic and transitive. If you only look at the implications that are good solely in virtue of the logical vocabulary, you just get classical logic or intuitionism, depending on whether it's multi-sextant or single-sextant. The logic of non-monotonic consequence relations can itself be monotonic, but it can express in the logically extended object language the non-monotonic relations of implication and incompatibility that structure both the material pre-logical base language and the logically compound sentences formed from them as they behave in derivations that substantially depend on the non-monotonic material base relations. Substructural expressivist logics suitable for making explicit non-monotonic, non-transitive material consequence and incompatibility relations are accordingly not far to seek. They can easily be built by applying to non-logical axioms codifying those material relations of implication and incompatibility variants of Gentzen's connective definitions that are equivalent to his under his stronger structural assumptions. It turns out that the relations of implication and incompatibility that then hold in virtue of their logical form alone are still monotonic and transitive, even though the full consequence and implication relations codified by the logical connectives is not. So if you want cut and monotonicity, you can still have them for purely logical consequence. Remember that from the point of view of logical expressivism, the point of introducing logical vocabulary is not what you can prove with it, but what you can say with it. Not what implications and incompatibilities hold in virtue of their logical form alone, but what implications and incompatibilities you can express using its conditional and negations. And expressivist logics let us say a lot more than is said just by their logical theorems. Okay, I want to tell one more story. And once again, if this is just more than you're in a mood to process, you won't lose any of the main philosophical points. But I want to talk about something else that our logics can do. The master idea of logical expressivism is that logical vocabulary and the concept such vocabulary expresses are distinguished by playing a characteristic expressive role. They let us talk in a logically extended object language about the material relations of implication and incompatibility, what's a reason for and against what, that already articulate the conceptual contents of non-logical vocabulary, as well as letting us talk about the logical relations of implication and incompatibility that are built on top of those material relations. Expressivist logics are motivated by the idea that we unduly restrict the expressive power of our logics if we assume that the global structural principles that have traditionally been taken to govern purely logical relations of consequence and inconsistency must be taken also to govern the underlying material consequence and incompatibility relations. So we don't presuppose Procrustean global structural requirements on the material relations of consequence and incompatibility that we want to codify logically. Here's a further idea that we've developed in what I'm calling expressivist logics. Instead of imposing structural constraints globally, we can relax those conditions and then introduce vocabulary that will let us say explicitly in the logically extended object language that those structural conditions hold locally wherever within the material consequence relations they do hold. Material consequence relations, I've claimed, are not in general monotonic. But they're not always and everywhere non-monotonic either. Some material implications are persistent in that they continue to hold up upon arbitrary additions to the premises. These are the ones that classical logic codifies. It follows from the fact that the regular Euclidean planar polygon has more than 3 sides that its angles add up to more than 180 degrees, no matter what additional premises we throw in. The mistake of the tradition was not to think that there are material implications like this, but to think that all material implications must be like this. Logical expressivists want to introduce logical vocabulary that explicitly marks the difference between those persistent implications and incompatibilities, the ones that persist under the addition of arbitrary auxiliary hypotheses or collateral premises, and those that are not. Such vocabulary would let us draw explicit boundaries around the islands of monotonicity that are to be found, surrounded by the sea of non-monotonic material consequences and incompatibilities in our actual reasoning practices. From a Gentzenian perspective, expressivist logics work out a different way of conceiving the relations between his structural rules and his connective rules. Connectives are introduced to express local structures. The paradigm's the conditional, which codifies the implication turnstile by satisfying the Ramsey conditions in the form of conditional proof and converse conditional proof. Conjunction codifies the comma on the left of the turnstile, and disjunction codifies the comma on the right of the turnstile in multi-succedent systems. Negation codifies incompatibility. Our expressivist logics show how, in addition to the structures already captured by those traditional sentential connectives, further connectives can be introduced to mark local regions of the consequence relation where structures such as monotonicity and transitivity do hold. I'll try to give some idea about how this works by quickly sketching what is for us the paradigmatic case, monotonicity. The first idea is to extend the expressive power of our proof-theoretic meta-language so as to be able to distinguish persistent implications, monotonic ones. In addition to the generally non-monotonic snake turnstile, we can introduce a variant with an upward arrow to mark persistent implications. That is, those that hold monotonically, so that if gamma snake turnstile up arrow A holds, then it holds no matter what else you put on the left of the turnstile, whatever else you add to gamma. We can introduce this upward arrow to mark persistent implications, that is, those that hold monotonically. Doing that is adding quantificational expressive power to our proof-theoretic meta-language. Gamma turnstile up arrow A says not only that does gamma imply A, but so does every superset of gamma. Gamma turnstile upward arrow A, just in case for every X, every set of premises X, gamma together with X implies A. All the connective rules can then be stipulated to have two forms, one for each turnstile, the turnstile without the upward arrow and the turnstile with it. So we can write the right rule, conditional proof for our Ramsey test conditional, showing the persistence arrow as optional. And this is the first thing on the display. If there's no upward arrow on the top turnstile, then there's none on the bottom either. But if there is a persistence indicating upward arrow on the premise sequent, then there's one also on the conclusion sequent. If gamma together with A persistently implies B, no matter what further premises we had joined to them, then gamma persistently implies the conditional, no matter what further premises we had joined to it. That follows from the original rule together with the definition of persistence. From this more structurally relaxed, non-monotonic vantage point, traditional monotonic logic looks just the way it would if there were a notationally suppressed upward arrow on all of its turnstiles. From that point of view, what we're doing is introducing the turnstile without the upward arrow. If you look at the upward arrow, you just get classical logic. Incompatibility and so logical inconsistency also look different in this setting. We now can distinguish materially incoherent premise sets from persistently incoherent premise sets. These are premise sets that are not only incoherent, but whose incoherence can't be cured by the addition of further premises. And we can restrict explosion to those persistently incoherent sets. In the single succedent case, we just stipulate this. Not ex falso quodlibet, but ex fixo falso quodlibet. In the multi-succinent case, we don't need this stipulation. It falls out of the standard Gentzen treatment of negation. Here we want to say that what was always right about the idea that everything follows from a contradiction is that persistently incoherent premise sets imply everything. In that case, you can throw up your hands and say, well, we just can't reason here. It's just that in rigidly monotonic systems, all incoherence is treated as persistent, so that in that expressively impoverished setting, ex falso quodlibet and ex fixo falso quodlibet are equivalent. But once the dual turnstile apparatus is in place in the meta language, we can introduce a modal operator in the object language to let us say that an implication holds persistently. The basic idea is to introduce a monotonicity box, a kind of necessity, that says that gamma implies box A just in case gamma persistently implies A. That is, if and only if it doesn't matter what else you throw in among the premises, gamma still implies A. To say that gamma implies box A is just to say in the object language now that gamma persistently, that is monotonically, implies A. From the point of view of a globally non-monotonic implication relation in which local pockets of monotonicity are marked in the object language by implication of modally qualified claims, the box claims, the assumption of global monotonicity appears as what happens when one looks only at the monotonicity necessitations of claims. That is, if you get monotonic systems, if you ignore anything that isn't of the form box A. From this point of view, we're just introducing non-necessitated claims, claims that don't have that modal operator in front of them. In fact, we can do a lot better than what I've indicated so far. The expressivist idea is that the point of introducing logical vocabulary is to provide expressive resources that let one make explicit crucial local structural features of relations of implication and incompatibility. In the first instance, material ones, and only as a sort of bonus, the logical relations that are built on top of them. From this point of view, what matters most is local persistence of some material implications. For it's those regions of local monotonicity and the material-based relations of consequence and incompatibility that we want to be able to capture with monotonicity modals. Happily, it turns out that all we really need is an upward arrow turnstile marking implications that can be weakened by the addition of arbitrary sets of logically atomic sentences. The result of the addition of this apparatus is that extensions of material consequence and incompatibility relations to a language including logically complex sentences, including those formed using the monotonicity modal box, that's well-defined and conservative of the material base relations. And it follows that if the base relations are non-monotonic and don't satisfy any version of cut or transitivity, neither will the extended ones. Okay, let me finish up. Construed narrowly, logical expressivism is a response to the demarcation question in the philosophy of logic. It suggests that we think of logical vocabulary and the concepts such vocabulary expresses as distinguished by playing a particular expressive role. The expressive task distinctive of logical vocabulary as such is to make explicit relations of consequence and incompatibility, to allow us to say what claims follow from other claims and what claims rule out which other ones. Construed more broadly, logical expressivism invites us not to think about logic as having any autonomous subject matter, not logical truth, nor even logical consequence. Logic does not supply a canon of right reasoning, nor a standard of rationality. Rather, logic takes its place in the context of an already up and running rational enterprise of making claims and giving reasons for and against claims. What logic does provide is a distinctive organ of semantic self-consciousness for such a rational practice. It provides expressive tools for talking and thinking, making claims about the relations of implication and incompatibility that structure the giving of reasons for and against claims. We should want those tools to be as broadly applicable as possible. The rational relations of material consequence that articulate the contents of non-logical concepts are not in general monotonic. Good inferences can be infirmed by adding new information. Indeed, offering finitely statable reasons typically requires that the implications we invoke be defeasible. Logic should not ignore this fact, nor should it aim to rectify it. Logic should aim rather to codify even non-monotonic, non-transitive reasoning. And what I've here called expressive logics do exactly that. The tweaks required to the proof-theoretic apparatus Gentzen bequeathed us for it to be capable of codifying non-monotonic, even non-transitive reasoning are remarkably small. That fact tends to confirm the expressivist's philosophical claims about what the point of logic has been all along. Expressive logics move beyond traditional logic, not only in being built on antecedent relations of material consequence and incompatibility, and in refusing to impose all but the most minimal global structural restrictions on those relations. They also introduce logical vocabulary that lets one express in the logically extended languages with its logically extended relations of consequence and incompatibility. It allows you to express local regions where those stronger structural conditions do hold. The paradigm is the introduction of a modal operator to mark the special class of monotonic implications, those that can be arbitrarily weakened with further collateral premises. And that turns out to include all those that hold in virtue of the meanings of the logical connectives alone. The benefits of treating monotonicity as a modality are many, and the costs are few. Treating logic as built on and explicating, elaborated from and explicative of, material relations of consequence and incompatibility offers another option besides substructural logics when relaxing global structural constraints. One can introduce logical vocabulary to codify fine-grained local structures. These monotonicity modal expressivist logics implement technically a central methodological principle of expressivist logics. Don't presuppose Procrustean global structural requirements on the material relations of consequence and incompatibility that one seeks to codify logically. Instead, relax those global structures and introduce vocabulary that will let one say explicitly in the logically extended object language that they hold locally, when in fact they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and stimulating talk. We should have plenty of time for questions. If people want to send your questions in to me, why don't we start with Jakob?
Okay, thank you once again for that intriguing presentation. So I take it that it is permissible to say that what you have here talked about are the semantics of logical vocabulary in a broad sense. So I would be interested if you are in the new book or in some other work delivering new work on the pragmatics of logical vocabulary, or what is the making explicit relation, what is the making explicit process, or what is it as a doing? What is it that we are concretely doing in expressing this logical vocabulary? And of course, you set the base for that in between saying and doing. And I was wondering if you still think that, for example, the response substitution mechanism still plays a crucial role, and how do you think to perhaps elaborate that if you are thinking of doing that?
Okay, very good question. I mean, I do think I still would think in terms of the response substitution mechanism there, but I think of that as what we're doing in introducing the logical vocabulary. But I hear you asking, particularly in the first part of your question, a more basic question that's sort of upstream from that. We could put it by saying, well, what does the turnstile mean? What is an implication relation in pragmatic terms? You say we're using it to articulate the semantics, to give us semantics for logical vocabulary, but what is it? And here I think the basic clue is Restall and Ripley's bilateral reading of the multi-succedent turnstile. When you say the set of premises gamma implies the set of conclusions delta, their bilateral interpretation, looking at both sides of the turnstile, says you're forbidden from affirming all the sentences in gamma and denying all the sentences in delta. That position is out of bounds. The way I would put it is accepting all the premises in gamma, which is a kind of commitment, precludes you from being entitled to reject all the sentences in delta. It's a preclusion of entitlement relation. And I'd say in the same way, to say that the set gamma is incompatible with the set delta is to say that commitment to accept all the premises in gamma precludes entitlement to accept all the sentences in delta. So I would think about the pragmatics ultimately in terms of commitments and entitlements. That's what I think is pragmatically codified in the turnstile and in effect in the perp in the meta language for implication and incompatibility that we're then showing how to capture, how to express in a logically extended object language.
All right. Yeah. I have the next question, if I may. I have a question about how you exactly see the relation between semantic inferentialism and logical expressivism. More specifically, would like to know in how far you would think that logical expressivism is a position that only can be defended by a semantic inferentialist. And I ask this question because of two reasons that raise some possible doubt about such inseparable connection, or that makes it, at least for me, unclear what your own position is as regards this question. So for example, in your 2018 paper, you presented now, you seem to define logical expressivism as a position that logical vocabulary has the expressive role of making explicit conceptual content. And this content is then explicated in the semantic inferentialist way in terms of material relations of consequence and incompatibility. But for example, in your 2008 book, Between Saying and Doing, you also give a detailed characterization of logical vocabulary. And there in the introduction, you write, for example, that that book is a little bit different, has different purposes from the semantic inferentialist project in making it explicit. And also there's this article by Ulf Lobel, of course, with whom you collaborate, and he doesn't, when he defines logical expressivism, I don't think he also theoretically commits himself to semantic inferentialism. And next to this kind of reasons, there might also just be independent reason for thinking that the two positions are, for doubting at least, that they're inseparable. So it seems to be that it might be a legitimate position to argue that the conditional makes explicit relations of material implication, or consequence, and the negation codifies material relations of incompatibility. But it seems just to be a further extra additional theoretical commitment to also say that these material relations of consequence and incompatibility constitute propositional content. One might also give a more traditional truth or reference kind of approach to propositional content, and then in that sense also be a logical expressivist without committing oneself to the semantic inferentialist story.
Okay, good. I agree with the characterization that you ended with. Semantic inferentialism and logical expressivism are independent claims. One could accept one without accepting the other. One could be a semantic inferentialist and have a different view about the inferential role of logical vocabulary. For instance, Neil Tennant thinks that the task of logic is to codify specifically mathematical reasoning. That's all. And that's why it's fully structural. He could be a semantic inferentialist and think that, and not be a logical expressivist in the sense that I'm talking about. If you're a semantic inferentialist and believe that at least an essential element of the conceptual content of non-logical expressions, ordinary empirical, what's expressed by ordinary empirical, descriptive vocabulary, red, square, mass, and so on, is the relations of material implication and consequence that they're codified by, well, logical expressivism is a wonderful semantically inferentialist account, I think, of the conceptual content of logical vocabulary, but maybe you have a different theory about it. If you're a logical expressivist, you don't have to be a semantic inferentialist. I mean, in effect, you will be a semantic inferentialist about logic if you're a logical expressivist, because what you're doing in specifying a semantics for logic is specifying its inferential, and expressive role, specifying its inferential role relative to the inferential role of some other expression. But you needn't think that that's the right sort of semantics for non-logical expressions. Indeed, what's typically called logical inferentialism is precisely semantic inferentialism just about logic. And it is often associated with people who care about Gentzen's proof theory rather than about Tarski's model theory in thinking about logic. But if you're a logical expressivist, but not a semantic inferentialist, you start off the way I actually started off today, saying, well, we philosophers care about reasoning, about reasons for and against. Maybe you don't think that's where you should get your semantics from, but we still do care about that compelling, mysterious force of the better reason that so fascinated the ancient Greeks. And you can, well, the logical expressivist says the job that's specific to logic and the reason logic's important for philosophy is that we care about reasons and reasoning, and this gives us a powerful expressive tool for articulating reason relations, being a reason for and reason against. Now, of course, that's particularly important if you think that those reason relations are essential to the semantic content of non-logical expressions. Semantic inferentialism and logical expressivism work and play together very well, but you can hold one without holding the other. So though Leuven is in fact a semantic inferentialist, he wants to speak to those who are not or who are agnostic about it and show them that they can think about logic in this expressivist way, regardless of your semantic views about non-logical things.
Okay, do we have further questions? Okay, we have a question from Peter Verde, who says his microphone doesn't work, so I'll just read the question. Could you elaborate on the relation, if any, between the logical system you've been arguing for and the system of core or classical core logic Tennant has devised and defended, and which I did too with a different motivation, but that's beside the point.
Yeah, I'm not actually in a position to do a compare and contrast in that way. There are interesting connections. I pointed out that although we're interested in codifying non-monotonic consequence relations, which is not the focus of Tennant's work, we're really not doing non-monotonic logic, because the logical portion of the consequence relation of the logically extended language that's built on top of a material consequence relation, the logical portion of that is just classical logic or intuitionism that is fully structural. There are also, in the logically extended relations, implications and incompatibilities that hold because of the material relations of consequence and incompatibility. So really, the way to compare Tennant's core logic with our logics as logics is just to compare his with classical and intuitionist logic, which of course he's written about a great deal.
Okay, a question from Professor Kappers.
Thanks again, Professor Brandom, for giving us this sketch of an expressionist logic. This is just a question about the notation of the non-monotonic turnstill, the snake turnstill. So you said in the Tarskian sense we have model theory, it's more semantically. And in the proof theory of Gentzen, we work more syntactically. So my question is, how do I have to interpret the snake turnstill? Is that in the first instance in the proof theoretical dimension, as also the structure of the paper suggests? Or is there a kind of modeling theory possible of this turnstill, snake turnstill?
Okay, good. I mean, both of those are true. We're elaborating the logic in a Gentzen style proof theory. It's a sequent calculus proof theoretic formulation. We write sequence using the snake turnstile rather than the arrow that Gentzen himself used. But it's a proof theoretic approach. I said something in response to an earlier question about how you can pragmatically understand what it means. You know, what a sequent is saying that commitment to accept everything on the left of the snake turnstile precludes entitlement to reject what's on the right. But you ask about the semantics, about a model theoretic semantics. Dan Kaplan, finishing up his PhD at Pittsburgh now, has adapted Girard's phase space semantics to give an implicational phase space semantics that's sound and complete with respect to our multi-succedent system. So roughly the way it works is you look at a space of fix a language, a non-logical language, fix in that language all the possible sequence. So every pair of a premise set and a conclusion set, and distinguish some subset of that as the good ones, and now associate as the semantic interpretant of each implication the set of all the other implications that if you fuse them, union the premises and union the conclusions, gives you a good one. So you can think about that as associating with each candidate implication a range of subjunctive robustness, or saying, well, what additions do we need to make to this that would keep it a good implication if it is a good implication, or would make it a good implication if it's not. And he shows how to understand our connective definitions in terms of that substructural implicational phase space semantics, even for these non-monotonic, non-transitive underlying consequence relations. So there is a semantics that goes with this proof theory, as there is a pragmatics, the Restall-Ripley bilateral pragmatics that goes with it.
But could I have a further note on this? Now, in line of the paper of yesterday, think about Wittgenstein's skepticism about semantics and about meaning. Is it necessary to have that semantics? Could you not immediately have the kind of Gentzen structure and then, well, it's not developed, but you could then, in terms of commitment and entitlement, directly have a pragmatic description of what you do in the Gentzen style here?
Yes. As far as we're concerned, you don't need that semantics, because we've fully specified the role in reasoning of the logical expressions by using the proof theoretic apparatus. But there is among philosophers of logic this ideological split between people for whom a proof theoretic account is all you need to fully semantically understand something, and the people who say, no, I don't really know the meanings of these expressions until I've got a model theory for it. So we're perfectly happy and the way I would think about that opposition is really both sides are concerned with specifying conceptual roles, that is specifying relations of consequence and incompatibility. But there's two broad families of meta-language that you can do that in: proof theoretic meta-languages and model theoretic meta-languages. And they're good for different things. They have different expressive virtues. So I'm a pluralist about those meta-languages for specifying inferential roles as well. And there are some expressive advantages to Kaplan's substructural implicational phase space semantics, thought of as a meta-language for specifying relations of implication and incompatibility.
Thank you.
We have further questions? Okay, we have another question from Jaco. You can ask your question.
Okay, so about how question about how is material reasoning constrained by the norms implicit practices? So sort of try to dig deeper into what sort of constraint is in question, and in particular, the term precludes that sort of carries the weight in the definition of material incompatibility relation. So two commitments are incompatible if and only if one commitment to one precludes entitlement to the other. So I read it from somewhere that the term precludes is actually not discussed in making explicit what it actually means. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, good. I mean, that's a modality that's doing a lot of work in that pragmatics. In the account in making it explicit, everything is done from the point of view of a scorekeeper, of someone who is understanding sentences in terms of the difference that committing yourself to that sentence makes to the commitments and entitlements that you attribute to begin with, to the speaker, and then in a secondary way to the audience. And the preclusion has to do with the norms governing scorekeeping. They're saying correct scorekeeping includes this requirement. So it's a norm internal to the scorekeeping that if I attribute a commitment to the premises, a commitment to accept the premises, I cannot then, it would be incorrect for me from a scorekeeping point of view to attribute entitlement to, in the case of incompatibility, entitlement to the incompatible claim. So we're looking at norms of scorekeeping, and talk about preclusion is talking about, in effect, the what we could put in, we're putting into rules the implicit norms of scorekeeping. So we can say, I mean, another sort of principle like that would be if I treat these things as incompatible, so you've committed yourself to gamma and committed yourself to A, which I take to be incompatible with it. I attribute all those commitments, sort of, that's up to you. I cannot attribute entitlement to, well, any of those commitments if they form an incompatible set. You're going to have to withdraw or reject something for me to treat you as entitled to any of those. Now, the entitlement then matters interpersonally. The only reason it matters whether you're entitled, according to my scorekeeping, is whether I take other people to be able to inherit that entitlement from you. Use your utterances as premises in their reasoning that they're at least prima facie entitled to. I don't know how helpful all that is.
Any follow-up, or do we have further questions? Maybe at this point I can ask a broader question as someone who's not an expert in advanced logic. If you could do a bit to perhaps situate logical expressivism and the themes discussed today in a broader philosophical context of reorienting from this inheritance of analytic philosophy emphasizing the primacy of formal structures and constraints taken as global, as you say, Procrustean requirements on things like knowledge, explanation, conceptual activity generally, and toward a primacy of practice and embedded finite cognitive agents engaging in sort of approximative and diffeasible reasoning. So you mentioned Cartwright on laws of nature. Also, there's Mark Wilson criticizing the received view of concepts in analytic philosophy, which I take to be highly conciliant with the themes that I've been hearing today. So it seems like this is part of a much broader program, or maybe you can comment on that, and it could be a program that's exercised also in other areas of philosophy, like philosophy of science, for example.
So it is sometimes necessary to sort of situate a constructive program like this by saying sort of what we think is wrong with other ways of doing things. That's not my preferred way of operating, though in this paper I did contrast the substructural logic, that the logics for substructural rational relations with ones that model ordinary reasoning on logic. The principal villain, I think, the view that we're most concerned to avoid is logicism about rationality. That is, a view that understands rationality to consist in reasoning according to logically good implications and incompatibilities. This has been a dream long before there was analytic philosophy. This was a dream to capture in a logic sort of rationality so that good reason ultimately should be understood as logically good reason that would find behind any good reason a logically valid implication, behind any incompatibility a logical contradiction. And this, I think, is a fundamental mistake. Logical expressivism, which I take to have been introduced by Frege in his Begriffsschrift, where he emphasizes that he understands logic not in terms of what you can prove with it, but in terms of what you can say with it, and thought of his logic as a tool for expressing, to begin with, the concepts, to make explicit the conceptual contents of arithmetic concepts, but then other mathematical concepts. And he says ultimately the concepts of the non-mathematical sciences as well. It's a tool for explicating the conceptual contents in the sense of inferential roles of concepts. Now, the later Frege fell away, I think, from this expressivist view into a more truth-oriented sort of semantic structure. But he started with this expressivist picture. One thing that seems to me a benefit for philosophers from thinking about logic in an expressivist way is it shows why philosophers should care about logic, even if you're not a logicist about rationality, and even if you don't subscribe to the program of analytic philosophy, which, as I adverted to very briefly in the earlier talks, I think of as, the program of analytic philosophy as characterizing the meaning of some problematic vocabularies, theoretical vocabulary, normative vocabulary, intentional vocabulary, which you find problematic in some way, in terms of expressing it, analyzing it, translating it into some base vocabulary that you're comfortable with. One range if you're an empiricist, another range of base languages if you're a naturalist. And what connects them was logic. That was the idea that you were going to use logic to elaborate the contents of the problematic vocabulary from that of the base vocabulary, or reduce or translate by using logical vocabulary, which was thought of as sort of transparent for this purpose. And I think we've moved beyond those programs. Analytic philosophy, I think, conceived that way, has pretty much run its course. It was a great idea if we could do it, but it doesn't look like that's possible. If you're not a logicist about rationality and you don't subscribe to this ultimately reductive conceptual analysis by logical translation program of analytic philosophy in any of its variants, does that mean it was just a bad idea for philosophers to be concerned about logic? Those are, I think, the two principal rationales that there have been in the philosophical tradition for thinking that logic matters in philosophy. And logical expressivism offers another reason, one that is not hostage to those deservedly controversial ways of thinking about the significance of and relevance of logic to philosophy. Just look, what philosophers care about is giving and asking for reasons. That's where we started with Socrates, and we care about articulating in a fine-grained way the role of concepts in reasoning. Again, that's what Socratic Elenchus was doing. And if we understand what's the distinctive expressive role of logical vocabulary as making explicit what follows from what and what's incompatible with what, letting us talk about reasons for and reasons against, then the care and feeding of those concepts, those reason explicating concepts, is of considerable philosophical significance. If in addition you think that role in reasoning is conceptual content, or anyway is an essential element of conceptual content, if in addition you're a semantic inferentialist, well then the way to get clear about your concepts, which for a semantic inferentialist to think clearly is to know what you're committing yourself to, what follows from the claim you're making, and what would be evidence for and against it. And by the way, to write clearly is to write in a way that lets your reader be able to tell what you mean to be committing yourself to and what you take would be evidence for it and against it. Well, the expressive tools of logic are the ones we use to explicate concepts clearly. And that's central to the philosophical enterprise, not because logic is a canon of reasoning or gives us not because good reason means logically good reason, nor because we're going to explicate problematic vocabularies in terms of unproblematic vocabularies with the use of logic. I mean, there's a sense in which this expressivist program is a successor conception to that analytic program that isn't hostage to the commitments that make that program seem unpromising a century in.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. Yeah. Do we have further questions from the audience? If not, I think we can close it out here. So on behalf of everyone, Professor Brandom, thank you so much for this really excellent seminar and for coming to Leuven virtually for the Mercier lectures this year. Thank you.
Thank you.